Thank you so much for inviting me to give a seminar here at the Academy. It's an honor to be here, and I'm very happy to be here and in Helsinki these days. Yes, so today I will talk about trophic rewilding, and the kind of paired talk tomorrow is, this is kind of future-oriented, and tomorrow is about the long debated issue of why are there not so many large animals around on the planet today, the megafauna extinctions of the late Quaternary. But let's leave that aside for now and take maybe a more positive view. Trying to make the technique work here. It's okay. Yes, so the big question that we are facing, we're facing many important questions these years, but the biggest question I would say is how do we maintain a livable biosphere in the future? And the good news is that we know what to do. We need to limit greenhouse gas emissions, because if we look at the high-end scenarios, they are not very nice. They're actually quite catastrophic, to be more precise. We also know that we need to upscale and upgrade space for nature, both to, if we want to overcome the biodiversity crisis, there's no way around that. But also, if we do so, it will help us tackle the climate change crisis, and also it will provide important co-benefits in terms of better quality of life for many people. And there's much to say about this, but it's pretty clear. At the same time, to achieve success with these things, we also have to maintain and improve human livelihoods and well-being, and that, I think it seemed a bit maybe crazy to have to say that, but it also means that we have to maintain free democracy, and those things go hand in hand. If we don't solve these three challenges at the same time, I think we'll solve none of them, because people, in the end, it's all about people in the end. If people get too unhappy about things, well, they vote for stupid people and you don't get the right solutions and so forth. So it's important to do these things at the same time. Let me see, I put this figure here just to illustrate the species-area relation that most of you probably have heard about. There's lots of noise in ecology, but one of the very strong relations is the relation between the amount of habitat area or useful area for biodiversity and the number of species. And it just highlights that we cannot hope to overturn the biodiversity crisis without allocating very large areas on this planet, not necessarily exclusively for biodiversity, but to have them have high functionality for biodiversity. It's not feasible to maintain most of Earth's species on small areas. That goes against basically the basic laws of biology. I would also highlight that when we think about climate change and climate change scenarios, the scenarios are quite wild, which I'll show you in a moment actually, but I also want to highlight that we are already in an unprecedented state, and you can see that state here, that the violet dot up there, that's the average of the last decade in terms of global surface temperatures, and then you have timescales down here, and of course most of you are used to these timescales, so what the point here is that the last decade is warmer than any longer period in the whole of the post-glacial period, the whole of the Holocene, which is the whole. So you can say, if you define human civilization, for example, as based on agriculture, basically it's warmer now than any time in the history of human civilization. So in that, from a human societal perspective, we are in an unprecedented state. In terms of what has happened with ecosystems since the last ice age, we're certainly also in an unprecedented state. If we look to future scenarios, and they are out here to the right, so we are here where the lines diverge. The top row here is atmospheric CO2 concentrations, and the bottom row are global surface temperatures. So, and of course we have different lines going to the future because what happens depends on ourselves, our emissions. We are currently close to the red line, and we are, if everybody keeps their promises, we'll land somewhere between yellow and red. And so far, I mean, it's not looking very much like people are going to keep their promises, so we'll maybe end in the high end. So then you can compare back in time. So already now for CO2 levels, we have actually to go back like 4 million years to find something similar. So that's pre-Quaternary. So that's before the onset of the northern glaciations, for those of you who are not paleontologists or geologists. And down here on surface temperatures, if we look a little bit into the future and we stay in this towards the high end or just in the middle end, you can see we have to go really far back to find something similar. And it's, in terms of the future scenario, we very easily get Miocene type climates. Quite a few of you here work on the Miocene, you know it's a very different world. In Denmark we have some nice fossil finds from the Miocene from roughly 15 million years ago, where the vegetation is very well preserved, and we could see that there was like a deltaic environment with subtropical vegetation, very similar to what we find in the southeastern US with bald cypresses, tubolo trees, this kind of vegetation. So a completely different situation from the present. And the point that I just want to make here is not that we will suddenly get this kind of environment. It's just that if we get these scenarios, and which we are on track to, everything that happens with ecosystems will change, because the boundary conditions that the climate provides will force things to change completely. And whatever that may mean, many things, but major complete change is on the menu at least. When you come from a place like Denmark and from many other places around the world, there are dense human populations. There's lots of agriculture. Most of the space is taken up by more or less intense human land use. And you can think about, okay, how do we find space enough to? How do we upscale space for biodiversity? How is that even possible? And one paper that came out a couple of years ago that after all had an optimistic message was this one that I'm quoting here. You can see the citation down here below. But it's a paper that showed that if the 54 richest countries on the planet would shift to something that's called the EAT Lancet Planetary Health Diet, which is not a vegetarian diet, but a kind of flexitarian diet, very plant-based, but also has a bit of animal-derived food in it. That would reduce agricultural emissions from these nations by a whole lot, but also allow to spare an area from agriculture the same size of the whole European Union wouldn't be needed for agriculture anymore. And of course that's a lot of space then that could be turned into habitat that has value for biodiversity. And that would be without losing any kind of food security, would probably increase our food security, it would probably lead to better health for people, for example. So it's just to highlight that there's strong opportunities to actually find this space with big co-benefits if we want to. It's not simple to reorganize the food production system, of course, but it's doable if we want in the end. But that's not what I will talk most about today, which will be the other side of what I talked about in terms of the need for upscaling and upgrading space for nature. And it's the upgrading I'll have focus on, and I think you can equalize upgrading in a more technical way with the term rewilding, which you can define as restoration to promote self-regulating complex ecosystems through, on the one side, restoring non-human ecological natural factors and processes, and on the other side reducing human pressure on the system. So you have the two sides, restoring the non-human natural ecological processes, and on the other side reducing human pressure on the system. I think it's pretty clear for any kind of meaningful ecological restoration, that's kind of always, the latter is always necessary, and if you want self-functioning systems, the former is also critical. And key aspects to consider here includes area, which I already talked about, area and connectivity, which kind of goes together, trophic complexity, which I'll come back to, which is part of a broader theme about biodiversity feedbacks. There's lots of dynamic in ecosystems that evolve feedbacks between biodiversity components where certain components promote biodiversity in other components, and it can go back again. You can think about between plant diversity and invertebrate diversity, for example, where there's a lot of positive feedback going on. And then finally there's geodiversity, or the diversity in the abiotic environment, and associated disturbance regimes like flooding regimes is also important. And I think this approach to restoration should really be the central approach. I really think it's, how to say it is, of course there's lots of context dependence on how you do things, but I think overall this should be the general approach. First of all, it's aligned to the overall dynamic, the demands of biodiversity. I'll come back to that. It's based on general principles that should work also in a future where everything ecological may change, you can say. It's not focused on fixed states, which will be increasingly impossible. It's based on autonomous, so in the sense, from a human perspective, autonomous processes, and that's super important because we need things done at scales and things done that last, and it's with the human demographic transition and urbanization and so forth, it's unrealistic to find lots of people to go and do all kinds of hands-on ecological management from now and forever onwards. It's not to say that there are settings where people can play a long-term role and will have to play a long-term role, and that's absolutely positive and fine. But there's a need for processes that don't rely on this, because there's lots and lots of places where people are actually scarce and will become more scarce in the future. So the trophic complexity side of rewilding is what we also in this paper to the right here introduced as trophic rewilding, and it's basically the same. I won't read out the definition, but it's basically the part of rewilding that has to do with top-down trophic effects. So effects from the upper parts of the food web downwards on the whole system, from the carnivores, but also on the very large herbivores, which are not necessarily top-down controlled by the carnivores. I'll come back to that. Down through downwards, you can say, in the whole food webs. And the focus in trophic rewilding is not by definition of megafauna, large-bodied species, but in reality it's very much so, because these have been selectively lost, which is part of my focus tomorrow. Plus, if you study systems that have them, they are super important for how ecosystems work. You can sum up the ecological effects that trophic rewilding seeks to restore, like in this graph. So you have different guilds of megafauna here: very large carnivores, megacarnivores, mesocarnivores, mesoherbivores, large herbivores, and megaherbivores. Megaherbivores are technically defined as those that have an adult body weight of greater than 1,000 kilos. And I'll come back to those, but they have particular strong effects in ecosystems. The arrows here indicate sort of the strength, and they generate different processes: browsing, grazing, direct interactions with the vegetation, you can say. Then nutrient and seed dispersal, I'll come back to that. Carbon pool diversification, there I've referred to the build-up of you can say, specialized biotic microhabitats, the living bodies, the dead bodies, and the poo, which is habitat and resources for lots and lots of organisms. And then finally they do non-trophic disturbances, erosion if you will, which of course from a human perspective is often seen as negative, but that's not necessarily or not so from a biodiversity perspective. Altogether these processes on the one side generate heterogeneity in vegetation and in the abiotic factors, and on the other side there's this enhanced dispersal, and these two things together enhance species richness at landscape and local scales. That's very well shown that environmental heterogeneity is a super strong, consistent, positive driver of species diversity, and so is dispersal. So that's the general idea. I'll talk about these things in a bit more detail now. First of all, on large herbivore effects on vegetation and soil, you can have that in mind at least. So this is from a figure where we summarized both present day and paleoecological evidence for large herbivore interactions or herbivore interactions with vegetation. And you can think about it in 2 dimensions. So this directionality here, you have functional diversity from the typical situation today with just some mesobrowsers and smaller herbivores, then towards more intact systems, and then out here to what has been typical from the mid-Cenozoic or a little bit earlier, even onwards all over the world, where you had a very functionally complex situation, including mega herbivores. And then you can go from low to high abundance, and that gives you different vegetation outcomes. Of course, that is modulated by climate, also some interaction with soil, but this is a generalization. Today, we most frequently have this situation here, just a very simplified herbivore community, and the herbivores are at low densities. For example, if you look in European natural areas, that's clearly the most common situation. Just some deer, but actually pretty low numbers in most places. And the situation there is, of course, if the climate is conducive to woody plants, you get very dense vegetation. If you just let spontaneous dynamics happen. The second most common scenario is what you have up here, that you have this kind of simplified community structure, but the meso-herbivores have been protected and have risen to very high levels. So that's like the deer overabundance situation that's being discussed widely, like in the eastern North America, in the British Isles, many other places. This is it's the second most common situation. And as we try to illustrate here, it's also not an ideal situation in terms of vegetation heterogeneity, because these small meso-herbivores at high levels, they tend to have a simplifying effect on the vegetation because of their selectivity in their diet, basically. In non-defaunated, or as you can say intact systems, what you actually get in bigger landscapes is all of this. It's not here. You might have been looking at this and thinking about, okay, this is like the optimal situation, I mean, from the faunal perspective, and then you get this vegetation, but that's not the case. You actually get all of this. And the reason for that is that herbivore space use is not uniform. And in particular, there's very strong scaling in terms of energetic use and body mass relative to terrain steepness. So the bigger species are more constrained by complex terrain, which is one reason why you get all of these outcomes in big, more complex landscapes. But there are also other things that can cause that you get these different outcomes. But terrain steepness is one thing that will give you this. And if you want to see it in reality, you can go to something like Yellowstone, and you can see this quite clearly, that you get these different outcomes. Yeah, this here is from a big meta-analysis where they looked at the relation between environmental heterogeneity and species diversity and found very strong support. So if there was no effect, you should be down here at the 0 line, and this stipple line is the average, so very consistent positive across scales. If you look at the strongest effects overall, it's actually heterogeneity in vegetation, which I just talked about, and also in terrain, but these are on par. So heterogeneity in vegetation is a super strong, consistent driver of species richness, and actually across scales. So having large herbivores generating that is super important. You can also turn it on its head. In most of the sort of more humid, more productive climates like most of Europe, Eastern North America, we know very well what happens if we allow vegetation dynamics to run spontaneously without human interference, without doing megafauna restoration. Then we get succession. And it's actually interesting when you think about it, the whole field of ecology, and certainly the whole idea around succession and succession theory and climax vegetation was really developed in defaunated settings, because that science was very much developed in Europe and in Eastern North America in the sort of early to mid 20th century, and at the time that was when deer populations were pushed to probably their lowest levels. Everything, bigger species had been eradicated already from the system. So when people, for example, in the Eastern North America studied oldfield succession, where there's lots of papers from this period, because agriculture was migrating from the sort of Eastern North America to the Midwest, so there was lots of land abandonment, and this was studied, and and there was a lot of science done on this, and you could see this oldfield succession. But what wasn't realized was that this was an unnatural situation, because it happened in a defaunated system where even the mesoherbivores was reduced to very low levels. But in any case, my point is, we know what happens in these kind of settings. If we leave things alone without restoring the fauna, then we get uniform dense vegetation eventually. And it's actually something that happens widely in Europe to this present day. This here is a satellite-based study that we did in the team in Aarhus, where we looked using the MODIS satellite sensor, its estimation of leaf area index, which is an estimation, basically, you can say, of vegetation density. We constrained it to only look at semi-natural and natural areas. And then what you see here, all the places that are in green, they're places where this density increased between 2001 and 2015. And we are working on updates to this, but this has continued. So you can see in most of Europe, and it's not an exaggeration, right? We see vegetation densification in the semi-natural and natural areas. And of course, I'm not saying there's just a single thing going on here, but it's very clear that an important element in this densification, decisive element in this densification, is actually lacking larger herbivores on the landscape. And I'll come back to that to show you one reason why we know this from I'll come back to that. But we know that that's a very important facet in this. This here is I want to also show you this work here. It's from a meta-analysis that we published last year, where we looked at large herbivore effects on ecosystems using exclosure studies or de facto exclosure studies from around the world, from big natural landscapes where somehow with large herbivores were at least some weighing 45 kilos or above, so that's like fallow deer size or more, where they were fenced out or otherwise excluded from part of the landscape, and people studied what happened with the ecosystems. And you can see how the distribution is here. It's pretty global. It's not unbiased, but it's pretty global in coverage. And this here is a figure that summarizes the sort of average effects that we could estimate in this meta-analysis. So violet is negative effects, and the thicker the line, the bigger an effect, and green is positive. So you can see, not very surprising, having larger herbivores reduce plant biomass, plant cover. It makes sense, it's kind of logical, but it's still interesting to see that this is general. You can also see maybe a couple of more surprising things, but actually very important things. So large herbivores, they very consistently reduce litter cover and increase bare ground. And you can think about those things as maybe not so nice or or something like that, but actually generating bare ground and reducing litter cover is super important for plant regeneration. For very many species are very poor at regenerating, where you have build up of dense litter layer, don't have any bare ground. This is this is actually a very practical problem in European natural areas, at least in the parts that I'm familiar with, that this kind is a strong constraint on vegetation dynamics. So they do that. In these studies, these individual studies, of course, all have replication, so we could also look at spatial variation in a given locality and look at to what extent the large herbivores increased heterogeneity at the site scale, and all the green arrows here indicate things where they increase heterogeneity. So the increased heterogeneity in plant biomass and plant cover, and in various other faunal aspects, they decrease heterogeneity in bare ground, so they generate generally more bare ground. So that's some generalities. Building on more or less the same data, we also looked at the role of nativeness and functional traits in shaping herbivore impacts on local plant diversity. And one of the key facets that we found, blue here is non-native and brown is native, and that didn't matter. I'll actually mention that later. But what is key is that in terms of functional trait, we found this as the strongest relation. So muzzle width, or mouth width, narrow-mouthed large herbivores, they reduce local plant diversity, while broad-mouthed herbivores, which would be bulk feeders, they increase local plant diversity. And our interpretation of this is that this has to do with selectivity, that the small-mouthed mesoherbivores, they are, as I mentioned before, they are very selective in what they eat. So if you have them in high levels, and of course all of these exclosure studies is done where you have fairly abundant herbivore populations, they reduce local plant diversity because they will consistently remove the preferred species, while the bulk feeders, they're bulk feeders, they offer more generalized disturbance, and that has a different outcome. Yeah, I want to touch about one topic which in relation to herbivore effects and relation to how to think about herbivores in a trophic rewilding context is the role of top-down control of large herbivore populations. And at least I would probably in many biology circles, but certainly in the broader society, there is the idea that in insect systems you have carnivores down-regulating herbivore populations to levels where you don't see much damage on the vegetation and so forth, and therefore that's, so you get that kind of nice harmonious situation. This here is from Yellowstone, where there was this famous, most of you have probably heard about it, reintroduction of wolves in the mid-90s because of perceived overgrazing by American elk, which is more or less red deer, Cervus canadensis. And what you can see is that since wolves were reintroduced, the elk population in orange really crashed. There's scientific debate out there how much of that has to do with wolves, but I would say if my reading of the literature is wolves probably had quite some impact on that. There may be other things also going on, but nevertheless the elk population went down as it should. But in most of the communication around this. The other dynamic that you see in blue is weirdly enough not being discussed, and it's that the bison population completely compensated. And actually now you can easily find a number of papers from Yellowstone that kind of problematicize what goes on with bison and ask kind of directly or between the lines calls for more or less strong culling of bison, which is super weird. This is a big national park, and there's a Holocene intact carnivore community with grizzly bears, mountain lions, wolves. So what is really and the bison is clearly, you can say, natural in the system. So what's going on with this? I think it's really misguided, but you can see a couple of pictures here I took in Yellowstone in 2011, so before actually the bison was fully up, but bison was already more common than elk. The lower one is an exclosure. So it just shows you that in this system, this is in the part of Yellowstone where there's most wolves. Even with a very completely intact carnivore community, you get that kind of impact on the vegetation. And the top one, if you notice these lodgepole pines, now people are worried about this species as invasive in Sweden, for example. I'm not sure about in Finland, but definitely. But they are actually debarked. And what was clear in Yellowstone is that very often when you see the tree lines, like you could see in the back there, very many of the trees would be killed by debarking. And you often get these kind of very, very sudden transitions, and where the transition zone is really marked by lots of dead trees. And it's not because it's wet when you get out. It's not like that. It's not wet. If you do botanizing there, you can see it's not wet. It's an herbivore effect that you get. But you can notice what I talked about before. In the back there, it's steep, and you have completely dense forest, right? And then where it's flat and more accessible to these guys, you get this very open vegetation. And you can even notice it down there. Also, it's not as dense as there, but you can see as you get back where it's more steep, right, you get many more trees. Yeah, so it's just to highlight these kind of dynamics. And I think, and people now, when they say there's a problem, right, they focus on here and there's no tree here. I think it's like a complete misunderstanding. Yellowstone is 70% tree covered or something like that. So it's quite strange, but yeah. Just to highlight this, because I think there's a fallacy there that many people still buy into. This is from my very good colleague Lise Leroux, where she studied the impact of megacarnivore restoration in South Africa, the impact on the large herbivore communities as a case where you have something bigger than wolves in the system. And you can see here in the pre-lion situation is in the white side, and then after lions, you can see the line there. After lions have recovered is in the gray zone, also wild dogs, but it's mainly the lions that are important. And then you can see the different herbivores here. They don't look at elephants here, just the other ones. And you can see the lions, and I think you can eyeball that the big species have increased after together with lions, right? The African buffaloes and the rhinos, while the wildebeest and the zebras, which are preferred prey, they have gone down. If you look at the total biomass, you can just look at that one over there. You can see certainly maybe a positive, but certainly not a negative relation between lions and total herbivore biomass. But it gets shifted to the bigger species. And if you recall what I talked about before, the bigger species have a different influence on the plant diversity versus the smaller ones. So it's very important to have in mind that having large numbers of deer is not equivalent to a more intact system. I already talked about these specialized biotic microhabitats, which are important for other fauna, and there's lots of cases. This one here is a fly that's dependent on old ungulate carcasses, and it was thought extinct in Europe in the 1800s, but was rediscovered in Spain in 2009, because thankfully there's some places where people don't clean up all the dead cows out in the landscape as we do in the rest of Europe, so it survived, otherwise it would be extinct. a horned dung beetle, which need big cow dung or something like that. It can't use deer dung for anything. Very rare nowadays in Northern Europe. We found it was quite common in last interglacial beetle finds from the UK, for example. And that up there is actually a picture of my leg. It's from fieldwork in Kruger, and I noticed this big tick on my leg, and I thought that looks pretty interesting, and it turned out it's a rhinoceros tick. It can only fulfill its life cycle on rhinos, not on professors, but it really needs rhinos for that, so it's just a case. Then a thing I also want to touch on is the last type of effect, which is super important, is that large herbivores promote dispersal. It's less visible, but it's super important. What you can see over there is based on a big analysis where we combined frugivore plant interaction networks with mobility data on the animals with seed passage times to estimate how far will a given animal, and it's only birds and mammals, how far will it move a plant that it actually disperses. And each dot there is a plant dispersed by an actual animal. And you can see this very strong scaling. So the big herbivores, which are the heaviest ones, right, are super important for the sort of, you can say, day-to-day movement. Of course, birds can take seeds to like faraway places, isolated islands and so on. That's a different kind of dynamic, but the sort of movement rates in the landscape in general, the big herbivores are super important for that. In terms of dispersal distance, they also disperse the biggest variety of seeds. There's other analysis that show that. Yeah, I don't really have time to go into detail, but I just want to highlight that this is a practical problem in European conservation today. If you do grassland restoration or something like that, lots and majority of grassland plants are actually super dispersal limited. They have a hard time getting to the sites, and in general there's a big issue around missing dispersers for many plant species in European landscapes today. Yeah, this here is an estimation based on the computations I showed you before, coupling that to the late quaternary extinctions, how much of the dispersal function has been lost, and the dimension towards red is lost due to past extinction, and the dimension towards blue is at risk from being lost from current endangerment. But you can see most of the world is pretty red, so that means that the estimated dispersal effectiveness for plant species in most places on the planet is super reduced because of the late quaternary megafauna extinctions. So that's dispersal of propagules, but you can do similar estimations for dispersal of materials like nutrients, and there's a lot of work that has been done on that by Chris Doty and colleagues and also others, and this is the whole field of zoogeochemistry. But you can do the same computations, and this is what these numbers are here. They are simple computations, but I think they're pretty robust, where you, based on allometric scaling, energetics, and dietary data, and composition of the diet. And so these reductions are reductions related to defaunation on late quaternary timescales. This down here is more, these two lower ones are more historical times, and this up there is including late prehistoric extinctions. Yeah, so clearly something that has fundamentally changed the systems. Yeah, so the last thing I want to talk about in terms of the generalities. Do I have 5 minutes more? Yeah, good, okay, I need that. I just want to highlight, since this is a kind of applied talk, that there's really a big blind spot in European conservation around big grazers as wild species. There's lots of talk about them as like tools or something like that, but I mean, cattle or ox and horse are super old wild species in Europe, and they're actually not extinct. I mean, the aurochs is extinct, but that's like the original wild form, but the species is not extinct. Most of the genetics, you can say, is still there. They do very well if they're allowed to live out on their own, and you could, I mean, in any case, it's surprising to me somehow that we don't have targeted conservation efforts for these two species, which are extinct in the wild in Europe de facto. That's kind of crazy when you think about it. They're not extinct really, right? So why don't we have like programs for them like we have for like giant panda or something like that? Is really crazy. And it's not the same case with the European bison, of course, but it's never, I would say the problem there is more that it's been super misunderstood as like only Eastern European species, very like, dependent on closed forests somehow, which is completely inconsistent with its longer term history, with its physiology and so forth. So it's more like a very misunderstood species. But yeah, from the horse perspective, this is just one paper that we wrote recently on some of the very latest never domesticated horses from northwestern Europe, from Denmark and northwestern Germany from 5,000 years ago, just at the onset of agriculture. As soon as domestic horses came in, roughly 1,000 years later, they disappeared. But we know these were the original wild population from DNA, and we could see, okay, we looked at how they lived using tooth wear and stable isotopes, and well, they lived like horses. They were mainly grazers, but they also did some browsing. One of the populations a little bit more than the other. Pretty consistent with how horses behave if you put them out in nature today. So just briefly touch on empirical evidence from trophic rewilding projects in Europe. We actually have many field sites and many field studies in Europe now. This here is from the very discussed Oostvaardersplassen in the Netherlands, which is a pretty big area. It's more than 40 square kilometers actually, so it's pretty big. It's very fertile. Of course, the climate is so it's nice for trees from the soil. It's nice for trees from the climate. But you can see here, this is the outcome of after roughly 25 years of trophic rewilding with uncontrolled horse and cattle populations, and they completely counteract the trees locally. But you can also see some of that in the back. There's actually plenty of trees, and if you look in the wetter parts, the site is half dry and wet, and the wetter parts actually get quite a bit of trees. So it's more the parts that are accessible to the herbivores where you get this. So overall, but it's just to show how powerful they can be in counteracting trees. Yeah, I don't have time to go through detail, but you can read this study if you want to read more about the vegetation dynamics in detail. This is just some more examples. This is from a rewilding site in Denmark. You can see it over there, a smaller site where we have lots of exclosures to test the effect of the herbivores. We have full exclosure, then we have a mowing treatment, and then we have access for the herbivores summer and winter or year round. This is covered by endangered plants in Denmark, and you can see where the herbivores have access, they do better. And these are the kind of plants that don't do well in the general landscape. That's why they're endangered. But they have a problem with the dense vegetation you get when the herbivores are not there. This is a German site, shows the same. This is a site from Białowieża. Białowieża in Poland is not just forest, there's also meadows, and this shows that the meadows have less woody encroachment, where the bison use them more. So this is just another case to show how you get these effects and you get these effects super consistently across Europe when you allow the large herbivores to be there. So it's just to say it's actually quite a lot, or there's a lot of empirical evidence that these things work. I think just in the name of time, I will stop there. I could talk about this for a lot more time, but I think it's a good place to stop. And I'm happy to take your questions.
Yeah, thanks so much for the talk, and we have now good time for discussion.
My name is Jan Schemelius. I'm an agriculture economist from Faculty of Agriculture and Forestry, University of Helsinki. Thank you for a very, very interesting presentation. I have very many questions, but start with just a few. First, you know, this European restoration law, do you see possibilities and then weaknesses in how it's currently applied? That's my first question. Then I would also have your point. It was very interesting to hear your point about this ox horse and the sort of Vincent. How do you see these? You have these kind of systems with suckler-cows, especially in Sweden, for instance, to sort of preserve or increase this kind of semi-natural lands. How do you see these systems with sort of suckler-cows? And then I just thought about this species, ox and horse and this stuff. So. How big would the areas need to be? I mean, if you would have some kind of systems for creating these type of things similar to suckler-cows, let's say in Finland or Denmark or Sweden, how big should the areas be? So these were a few questions. Thank you.
Thank you. They are all very good questions. I didn't totally get the term for the management system you refer to, but yeah, but this management approach that they do in Sweden.
Yeah, actually, I think they have quite wide actually areas. Sweden has a self-sufficiency in beef production, which is about 50%, and there are quite big areas especially in mid-Sweden, where the ecotypes are there's certain species which are dependent on that. There are these ruminants. So you have the suckler cows. That's what I know. Yes, suckler cows. Diko in Swedish.
Okay. Yeah, that's the term that I didn't get.
Okay. Diko in Swedish. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So, well, to start with the European Nature Restoration Law, I mean, I think it's super positive that we have it. I was actually at a science policy meeting about that law and actually how rewilding could play a role there in Brussels last week, together with, there are 3 kind of big horizon projects that work with rewilding now. So at least there's lots of interest, but it's specifically not named in the law. I don't know why, but I think in the end, if we want the law to be effective, we need to really have a major focus on these rewilding principles. And I can say that is certainly happening in Denmark. So we now, it's not tied directly up to the restoration law, but I'm very sure that it has played into the political process. We have a political decision to take out 9% of land area and convert it from agriculture to nature. And at least we'll have to see how that all will be managed, but as part of that, we at least will have big areas that will be managed according to rewilding principles, and I hope it will be most of those 9%, but we'll have to see. But I hope so, because otherwise I think it's not going to function as people hope. In terms of, let me see, your second question was, yeah, yeah. So that I still don't get what that term is. I'm sorry about that. It's but in any case, I think so. Low intensive management systems can certainly play a role where people are willing to do it. For example, in Denmark, and I think many other places, the problem is that it's hard to find people that, even if you pay subsidies, that want to do it. So that's a constraint. And again, it's very important that where it's done, it has to be on the large herbivores, and they have to be not overstocked. Very often when people do some of these things, they actually overstock to make enough money out of it, but then you get a negative effect. So you have to do it in the right way. And it's not recommendable to do it based on sheep and goats. I don't think that's a big problem in Sweden, but in various other parts of Europe it is, and that's not. I mean, their mesoherb was like I talked about before, and they have this effect. If you have lots of sheep and goat on the land, they actually simplify the floristics for sure. So that's not a great idea to do. In terms of area, I think you can do it very flexibly. So this area here is actually a super wonderful area. If you ever come to Jutland in Denmark, I recommend to go there. It's a rewilding site that's 120 hectares. It's managed by the Natural History Museum in Aarhus. It's been running since 2016. They're feral horses, feral cattle, and there's just a small normal like a electric line fence to keep them in, right, so they don't run away. That's the only fencing there is. It works super well, and you can see some of the outcomes there, but it works super well. Of course, these populations are not self-sustainable in the long term, so I think the model that you have to work with for these kind of areas in the long term is what a managed meta-population model. You have to move some animals around to avoid inbreeding, genetic drift, and so you can never let it completely go if they're so small, right? So that's, but you can get something. I mean, the alternative is to not have these areas function. Of course, so I think that's part of it. The other side of it is, of course, we should go for as big areas as possible wherever we can, and there you can more and more have more self-running systems, even for the larger species. Yeah, so, but I think one can go at that pragmatically. Just have in mind the functionality, that's the goal. So in that sense, you can scale it down to a few hectares in some ways, right? You don't get all the effects that you would get at the bigger scales, like the dispersal effects, but you can be informed and get the best outcomes possible for biodiversity. But the bigger scales is important, and it should be the sort of basis in like what we do in Europe to have big natural areas that really.
Any other questions? We have good.
Else I can also show more slides. I have more slides.
We have two more there and
there. Well, thank you for the talk. I really like it. I had some questions. You have some expectations about the reintroduction of, like, let's say, big herbivores, like in the northern parts of the world. But do you have some expectations if that happens in the tropics? I know that there isn't like large herbivores anymore because all of them are extinct. So I don't know if you have some information about it.
Yes, let me just see how to best answer that. It's a very good question. I'm sorry for only showing things from the far north, but let me just show you this here, for example. So this here is from India, based on a very big study in India that has led by an assistant professor in Aarhus, but he's Indian and he's worked with the Indian tiger program and the associated biodiversity monitoring program for more than 10 years. They actually have an amazing monitoring program they're in the Guinness Book of Records for camera traps in that program, for example, and they also have thousands and thousands of vegetation plots in all of the natural areas. So one thing we wanted to look at there is this idea that if we look at, there are many places around the world, certainly also in the global south, where alien plants cause problems and alien plant dominance is a problem, and in India it's actually a huge problem in the natural areas that you get over-dominance by certain introduced plant species. Invasive alien plant species, they can be difficult to diagnose, but one thing that's typical at generalization is that they are characterized by fast growth traits, what's called acquisitive traits in the plant functional trait literature, as opposed to conservative traits. So that's why they can build up a lot of biomass quickly and become dominant. Also is true for the most successful invasive alien plant species in Europe, for example. We expect that should trade off with your sort of tolerance to herbivory, because you don't invest in defense, you invest in growth. So we thought to look at, okay, where the large herbivores have been, and then specifically mega herbivores have been maintained, do they then have a negative effect on this alien plant dominance, which would be wonderful as a rewilding solution to this problem. And it turns out, you can see the numbers there, that's actually true. You can just focus in the red box. So it's from all over India, from natural areas, right? So what we look at there is the estimated effect of the mega herbivores of invasive cover. So that's the IC. And then we look at the effect size across a productivity gradient from very arid to mid-productive to tropical super wet. And what you can see is that in the mid-productive zone, there's a consistent negative effect of the mega herbivores on alien plant dominance. So it actually works. They reduce this over-dominance by these fast growth adapted introduced species. And if you look just in the D panel just above, it's the native plant cover, so it goes the other way around. And then in E, it's the native richness. So actually, in this very big data set, we at least see a very nice positive correlation between having a more or less intact large herbivore community and reducing alien plant dominance and maintaining native plant diversity. So at least these are general principles that I talked about before. I expect they would work in tropical systems. We also work in South Africa, not really tropical, but at least subtropical, and in Argentina, and we see also subtropical part of Argentina, and we see very comparable effects these places. Some of it is published, so I'm happy to share those papers with you later.
Hi, thank you very much for the very comprehensive talk. Trying to shape my question, let's see if I can do it. A big promoter also of open ecosystems and function open ecosystems, but I find it very difficult to promote conservation of open ecosystems, especially in the light of climate change solutions that tend to promote forest as climate, are promoting large projects of afforestation in places they shouldn't be. And at the same time, we have human-wildlife conflicts, and wildlife is the first one that we want to deplete from the landscape. So do you have counter-arguments that can speak more for the carbon sequestration of these open ecosystems, perhaps, or whether to talk about large areas to avoid human-wildlife conflicts when doing rewilding?
It's a very good question. I'll give it a try. I mean, I think it's not like easy, right? Then people would have done it. Let me see if I want to show you something. Maybe. I'll show maybe this one. So let me see how to start. So this here is an arrow of abiotic novelty. So that's, for example, more and more new climate, more and more climate change. This is biotic novelty. So that's especially alien invasions. This is the past. Then with classical restoration action, one would try to get it back to the past, but this keeps going, right? So this is going to be more and more impossible, so you get some kind of malfunctioning system. And the rewilding approach is accepting that things will change, but try to make it functional in a new setting. And what I want to say with that is, first of all, carbon, so the carbon sequestration that ecosystems can do is either in the live biomass or in the soil, basically. And in the live biomass, it's of course if the vegetation dies back, it's lost. So it's very important to maintain the adaptive capacity in the living side of things, for that it doesn't just die back and disappear, right? And that's just, you can say, from climate stress. One can see, for example, in Western North American forests now, there's very good data where you can see that that the sort of more northern species are failing to regenerate in very large areas, for example. But things can also happen very quickly, of course. With this kind of stress, you can get, and I don't need to tell you, but you can get huge fire catastrophes, right? Under this kind of stress, that then suddenly, and then the carbon goes right up to the atmosphere. So it's very important to promote a resilient, adaptive vegetation if you want to maintain carbon in the vegetation. So that may not maximize your short-term carbon gain, but it will give you safer carbon in the long term. So that's in the vegetation, right? Then so you could just, so that's, and you can think about the woody vegetation, but of course, then if you can get the carbon into the ground, then it's also relatively safe after all. And it's still open research, but there's various research that shows that, for example, reduction in above ground carbon in vegetation by elephants in an African setting was offset by increased below ground. So they didn't reduce overall carbon sequestration, but they pushed it below ground. I don't think that the data yet is sufficient to generalize that, but at least there are cases where one sees this kind of thing. So I think the overall argument is that with a rewilding approach, one could aim where one aims to have self-functioning systems. One can aim at having more resilient carbon sequestration, maybe not maximizing it, but having it more resilient both above ground and below ground. In terms of human-wildlife conflict, what to say? I mean, I think it's nuanced. I mean, like in Denmark, people can be afraid of some small cows or something like that, right? So I think there's lots to work on there where you can say, okay, you have to learn to be a little bit mature around these animals, and maybe I think there's societal education that you can learn, but of course, like now, like the mega herbivores, mega carnivores, they are really dangerous, right? And they are difficult to live with, some of these. So I think it's complicated. I'm very impressed, like in India, how they make it work with the tigers that live in these occupied landscapes, and even the tigers in the national parks, they mainly go out to prey outside the national parks and so on. So, but I think there's learning to do, but also take people's problems very serious. You need to have very good compensation schemes. You need to find other ways where you help people to tackle it. So there are these things going on. And then I think we should think very carefully about subsidy schemes and these kind of things also. So I mean, in Europe, we certainly put subsidies towards maintaining sheep grazing out in natural areas. And that, of course, then causes a big conflict with the recovery of carnivore populations, and it's for something that's not important for our food security or anything like that. And in many cases, it's also not really related to culture, because people still don't really want to be out there. So I'm not fully sure about EU, but I know, for example, in Norway, I mean, people just want to have the sheep out in the mountains in the summer without looking after them. That's not maintaining cultural traditions. Cultural traditions, you would have to be with the sheep to take care of them. So I think there's things to work on societally in different ways, but taking people's problems serious is one part of it, and another is more educational and taking a critical look at what we call tradition also.
All right, I might actually push you to the uncomfort zone, but regarding policy, in a perfect world, for the rewilding to happen, what kind of policy decision would need to happen?
That's a good question. First of all, I mean, first of all, we need to dedicate large areas for biodiversity, essentially. And I mean, I don't necessarily mean that people can't live there, but we need to define large parts of, let's say, Europe to I mean, like the 30% goal or something like that is a pretty minimum, I think. We really need to be serious about that. Say this has to work for biodiversity. Otherwise, because of course you can implement rewilding on smaller scales, but it will not matter for biodiversity conservation unless it's implemented at big scales. And also all the nature-based solutions we otherwise could hope for in terms of climate or water management and other, these are all scale to area. Also human mental health benefits from nature, scale to area, right? So if we want all of these associated benefits, we need large areas. So we need to allocate space enough, and then we have to be serious about making these areas function. And there, these principles I talk about are super essential. And there's lots of stuff happening in supposedly natural areas that's not very good for biodiversity, and we should take a really functional look at this. And learning, I mean, the rewilding thinking is a very good way to go with that, especially for the big areas, but also in general. So one should make it possible. I mean, and there are many things that could help, like the practical level, like for cattle don't require earmarks for wild living cattle. It's very cumbersome for managers, and to do that, they have to find all the calves and mark them and these kind of things. Adjust the animal welfare regulations somehow to scale. So you have, if you have animals in small areas, of course it makes sense that you have some regulation for that. But the bigger, if they have essentially unlimited area, I also think you can say, okay, then they have to take care of themselves. So have some kind of, so there are these kind of very practical things one should work on, for example, and not have subsidies, of course, for damaging things, including, I think mostly I would say don't do subsidies for sheep in natural areas. I think it's generally not a good idea.
Great. So we can have one last question if there are any. Oh, two. Okay, we take two.
Thanks. Just to follow up from the previous question, how has this developed during the last years? A few years, maybe a decade. I mean, how big are the biggest rewilding areas now, and are they getting bigger? And is there less regulations now concerning that?
It's a good question. I don't think the regulations have started to change really, but I would say definitely bigger areas. So I mean, I can start with Denmark, for example. So in Denmark we have national parks. They are paper parks. They are not associated to any extra conservation protection. That was part of how they were designed from the start, to make agriculture go along with them. So then a few years ago we actually got a decision to have nature national parks, which should then not be paper parks. And we now have a decision, and the first ones are being implemented, to have 20 of these around the country, and they should be roughly 1,000 hectares or more, and basically they should be managed from rewilding principles. So that's what is happening. There's various compromises done for various of them that I'm not always super happy about, but at least it's going in that direction, right? And broadly across Europe, there's also more and more sites that are managed more or less from rewilding principles, or where people also self-identify that that's what we are trying to do to different extents. So I would say that is definitely, I would say that's expanding quite rapidly, I would say.
Great talk, Jens, and great point you made earlier about public education as a means of getting people to understand human-wildlife conflicts. Do you think in relatively privileged societies like the West, the commonly sanitized view of biodiversity can actually become an obstacle for people to come to a realistic understanding of human-wildlife conflicts?
It's a very good point, and yes, I certainly do. I mean, in a place like Denmark, people are used to, if you go to the forest, it's completely safe. I mean, we also, I don't know if this is widespread in Europe, probably it is, but we have the concept of risk trees. And so that's, if you have an old tree that could be dangerous if it falls over, people will go and fell it, and it's super hard to, I mean, it's super hard to avoid this. Of course, there are like bigger protected areas where it after all doesn't happen if it's not close to a trail. If it's close to a trail, then it will happen. So there's a lot of this super sanitized view, and of course places where people are more accustomed to a bit more wild nature, whatever that means, right? Then, or even just having like cows in the countryside, then people are more used to some of these things. So that's a big obstacle. I think you can overcome it with public education and with the young generations making sure they have these kind of experiences and so on. I think you can work. That's doable, but it's an obstacle, definitely.